Welcome back to Hot Water Wrestling, and here I am with the other video I promised. I wanted to talk about, well, the PG era and the current state of wrestling, all around actually, but mostly WWE, and how I think things can get good again. A lot of people, when you say that you're unhappy with the PG era, they say that you can still have good wrestling in the PG era. And yeah, I do believe that. And for the first time ever, wrestling is being ruled ever more by the pen, by the writers. It didn't always used to be like that. This is the actual first time that the writers have had such a hold on the product, where superstars are really told exactly what to say and not given much wiggle room as to tweak their character or do things that they think of or spur of the moment things, which holds a lot of people back. That's part of the fun of wrestling and watching the certain characters develop over time, is that these guys find their voice. They actually find their niche and their calling, kind of like how Triple H was Hunter Hearst Helmsley and then eventually became Triple H. You can go back and look at the documentaries on him and see how that kind of came about. I don't know if something like that could ever happen today with the stronghold of the writers. But no, I don't blame bad wrestling strictly on PG. My problem with PG is that Raw, for example, is on in the evenings, and a lot of adults watch Raw, and the PG writing alienates us adults and kind of makes it into a cartoon kids show. And that's something I want to go at. That's something I want to touch upon right now. Let's look back at the golden era of wrestling, the 1980s, the era of Hulkamania, regarded as the single most greatest era of wrestling ever. Well, imagine if you were a 25-year-old guy in 1985 in the throes of Hulkamania, what you would think. Well, you would have grown up in the Bruno Sammartino, Superstar Billy Graham, Bob Backlund era. The most colorful wrestler at the time back then was Superstar Billy Graham, and then the most colorful wrestler in the company at the time, right before Hulkamania broke, would have been probably Sergeant Slaughter. Imagine what you would have thought about your wrestling if you grew up in that 70s era of Sammartino, Superstar Billy Graham, Bob Backlund, and so on. What you would have thought of this guy, Hulk Hogan, ripping his t-shirt off, having action figures, having a cartoon on television. I mean, if there was ever a change in pace, it was then, and it's regarded as the greatest era of all time. Wrestling was, if you look in the crowds in the 70s, in 70s matches, if you look in the crowds, a lot of the crowd is adults, and a lot of them are dressed up in like coats and ties or nice shirts and stuff. And imagine what all those people felt like when the 1980s came and they had action figures and they had cartoons and they had marketing and they started coming up with all sorts of silly characters. And then into the 90s, when it just got atrocious with that, is just silly characters and silly outfits and silliness to the nines, okay? I mean, silliness as far as the eye can see. We recovered from that. And we came into the Attitude Era out of all of that. Now, what made the wrestling in the 80s different than the wrestling of today, concerning the PG, concerning the children's marketing and all that, is that it was more of a pure sport, for lack of better words, in the sense that the writers were not so heavily involved. People were still able to tweak their characters the way they wanted. They could say what they wanted. There was not a lot of restrictions other than swear words and just being outrageously lewd. You could do whatever you wanted. There's a lot of racy things that happened in the 80s. I think adults and children could enjoy wrestling back then. But there had to have been fans that were completely pissed off about it, completely mortified by what happened in the 80s if they were fans in the 70s, because it really changed. There's a rumor going around, well, not a rumor going around, but it has been said, I guess I should say, that before Hulk Hogan came into the picture, it was said that Sergeant Slaughter was going to take the title from the Iron Sheik, and that a feud between Sergeant Slaughter and the Iron Sheik was being built. And it was at a time where Hulk Hogan went to go film Rocky III and was told he wasn't going to be able to come back to the company if he went and did that, because he would take time off. And I believe that involved Vince McMahon Sr. Well, Hogan went and filmed the movie anyways. And it seemed that, Backlund was going to drop the title to the Sheik, and then they were going to have a great feud between Sergeant Slaughter and the Iron Sheik. Now, at the time, Sergeant Slaughter had a theme music when he came out, that Army tune. I think it's Taps. And he was the first guy to do that. And they were really grooming him to be the champion of the company. Well, what happened is that Hogan did end up coming back. I think Vince McMahon Sr. either passed away. I know he passed away shortly right there. Either he had passed away or he had given the reins to his son. One of the two. Hogan was able to come back, and he actually cock-blocked, for a better word, Sergeant Slaughter out of that title, and he took it from the Iron Sheik, and thus Hulkamania was born. But it was originally supposed to go to Sergeant Slaughter. But the point of my video is that we can come out of this, and things can get better, and things can change, and they will change. Things are always changing in the landscape of wrestling. No one era is the same. There are similarities, but no one era is the same. And this is just another one of those eras that we're going to have to wait through. We don't know. Maybe the next era is even worse than this one, okay? God forbid. But if you really look at it, you had a lot more seriousness up until the 80s. And when the 80s came, heavy marketing came into play with wrestling. Character development, action figures, merchandise. A whole new landscape opened up, the era of the pay-per-view. And that got bloated and turned into the ugly three-headed monster. That was the early 90s. And then all this new wave of characters and all this new wave of going about doing things in wrestling washed over, and thus the Attitude Era was born, and all these great stars came out of it. So it's just going to have to be this one thing that sets it off. There's going to have to be this one giant push one day that's going to send wrestling in a new direction. And so I just wanted everyone to think about that. I know my video is a little bit all over the place, but the point of the video is that if you were a wrestling fan in the 70s, what you would have thought of the 80s. And if you were a wrestling fan of the Attitude Era, now what do you think of this PG era? And the moral of the story is that it always changes, and it can always be fixed. So let me know your thoughts on that, and I'll see you next time on Hot Water Wrestling.